Can you hear me? Good. Welcome. My name is Pamela All. I am Provost of the Academy for International Conflict Management and Peacebuilding here at USIP. And I am very lucky actually to provide a home for the Fellows Program. We have incorporated the 1.5 full staff members of the Fellows Program into the Academy as of last year, so we feel very strong ownership of the Fellows Program. The reason I am telling you that is that 3 of our panelists today are either present Fellows or former Fellows, and the 4th one is aspiring. Has adopted a name very close to the Fellows Program, and we are claiming him as well. So this is really a tribute to the work that goes on in the Fellows Program in terms of research and practical policy. So we are really here to look at civil wars and to ask the question of why do they reignite? And so often they do, and what can be done to lessen the opportunities for this reigniting. Obviously, this is a very important question. It's important to the countries themselves, especially if they have bothered to go through a peace process and signed an agreement. Why doesn't it hold? And it's very important to the people from the outside that are trying to help this peace process to hold. And yet I think we understand very, very little about the post-settlement, the post-end of Civil War dynamics, and why, as I said before, so many of them break out again. But we are also here because we are taking advantage of the fact that Chuck Call, one of the panelists, has written a book. And you can see we all have copies of the book. This book was not published at USIP, so we are not selling it out in the lobby. However, I'm sure you can find it. It is an excellent book, Why Peace Fails, The Causes and Prevention of Civil War Recurrence. And it gave us an opportunity actually to bring together a group of people who have been thinking very, very deeply about this topic. We are going to have, I think everybody has what, between 10 and 12 minutes to introduce some of their thoughts on this matter, and then we will go to questions and answers. And we are going to go in alphabetical order, and I will introduce all of the speakers before the panel starts, so we will just go from one to the other. But before I do that, I do want to recognize the 2 people, Lily and Gina, who actually organized this program. Lily Cole is the Senior Program Officer for the Fellows Program. And Gina, where is Gina here? Well, she has been helping Lily in organizing this program and will be coming back again, I'm sure. So with that, I think we will go straight into the panel. Let me introduce them. Charles Call, we call him Chuck, and was a fellow here. I'll start with the most important fact, was a fellow here several years ago, but he is an associate professor at American University. And he, as of 2 days ago, or yesterday, he started at the State Department and the Bureau for Conflict and Stabilization Operations, where he is a senior advisor. Carolyn Hartzell was also a fellow here last year, and she is a professor of political science at Gettysburg College. And when she was here, she was working on the relationship between the settlement, the agreement, the Civil War settlements, and post-conflict economic development. And she's also worked a lot on power sharing, which was something I think we'll be talking about today. Lise Howard is a fellow at USIP this year, But she is an assistant professor at Georgetown, and she is working this year on her project here on U.S. foreign policy and mediation in ethnic conflicts, and especially on institutional building after war. And finally, Ambassador Robert Loftus is currently a USIP interagency professional in residence, and we still call him a fellow, even though he has this rather elegant other title. He has just stepped down from being acting coordinator for reconstruction and stabilization at the U.S. Department of State. This is the predecessor entity to the bureau that Chuck just joined. So you have enormous expertise here in terms of responding to situations of conflict and trying to put countries back together after Civil War. Ambassador Loftus has also been our ambassador to Lesotho, and has worked on all sorts of issues at the State Department, ranging from peacekeeping to pandemics. So with that, I am going to turn over now to Chuck. I'm going to apologize a little bit ahead of time because I'm going to leave you at 3:15 and turn over to Lily. So I will just be sneaking out, but I had another engagement which I have to honor. So, Chuck.
Thank you, Pamela, very much. And thank you all for coming. And thank you, Lily, for organizing this. As Pamela mentioned, this was essentially the book that I mainly did while I was a fellow here a couple of years ago. Let's just say a couple in a vague way. And thank you to the fellow panelists, including Ambassador Loftus, who helped build the house that I'm now residing in at the State Department. And so I'm going to basically talk about the book, as you might imagine. And I'm sure that this will be discussion that's not just about the book, but about the broader issues that the book touches on here. So I first thought to do this book when I happened to be invited to sit and listen to the first meeting of the United Nations Peacebuilding Commission in 2006. It was an informal meeting of 31 member states who were trying to figure out what this new entity, a UN Peacebuilding Commission, was going to do. And it quickly became apparent that they were all talking about recurrence and war recurrence, and they were really, that was it. That was clearly going to be the standard of success of that organization, is if they engaged with countries and prevented them from relapsing into conflict. And I started thinking, well, Civil War recurrence, is that something that's different than Civil War onset? And what do we know about that? And has anybody written just about this? And I knew of an article by Barbara Walter, and there's a couple of other people who've written about it, but really not much of a book-length treatment of that phenomenon of countries. We have also literature on failed peace agreements, which have just held for a month or two and then fallen apart, but not countries that have entered into, basically reached either a victory or a peace agreement and had a period of at least a year of peace, and then everyone thought peace was happening, and then you have a war again. And so I decided I was going to look into this and write a book on this, and that's where this came from. And I started, and so now I'm going to move on to methodology. And so I said, how am I going to answer this question? Because I actually didn't know the answer to this question that I was asking, is why do some countries fall into civil war again and others do not? Pamela already told you why this is an important question, so I won't waste my precious minutes on that. But a lot of countries that experience civil war are countries, we know, that have already experienced civil wars previously and are experiencing recurrent or repeat civil wars. And so I went and looked at the database, and I looked at databases, and I did a quantitative study to see if this phenomenon was different than onset. I discovered that it was a lot like onset in a number of ways based on these regressions that I did with an economist colleague, but it's different in some ways I can talk about. They have to do with ethnic and religious fractionalization. I could talk about why that's important, but really it turned out not to be essential for the findings of the book, so I'm not going to spend any more time on it until Q&A. And then I also went on and wanted to do some qualitative work on this question. And I said, okay, one of the clear cases where you have a civil war and then a period of stability, if you will, and then a period, and by the way I define peace in this case was just the standard that most people use, a negative peace, which is there hot war or not? And there's, of course, a rich critique of that in the literature that I teach all of my students at American University, and I'm sure you're all familiar with, but really, we don't do this business very well. And if actually we could keep countries from falling back into war, then we would declare some degree of success, and then we could worry about getting them to Denmark. as Fukuyama says. So, and so I looked around, and I found basically, I did a case study of Liberia, and I did about 15 what I call core cases of recurrent civil wars. And I thought about giving you all the slides, but in the minimal time we have, I didn't want to do that. And so you can look at the book. Here's some flyers. There's discounts here, 30% discount from Georgetown University Press. Feel free. There's the code. But really, the cases include, and I'm going to just give you the findings of them, but let me just list some of them. There's separatist cases of Chechnya, Georgia, South Ossetia, Tibet in China, and Sudan, north-south. Non-separatist cases of recurrence of Haiti, Zimbabwe, Liberia, East Timor, and Central African Republic. And what I ended up looking at severe chronic exclusion that had recurrent civil wars that involved mass violence of Burundi and Rwanda. Now, let me just mention a couple of things, because you're always thinking, how come he's not counting my country that had a recurrent civil war? And how come he's counting that country, which didn't really have a civil war, like Haiti or East Timor? Well, one of the things I wanted to do was make this policy friendly and looking at cases and relevant. So I defined recurrence in a way that some might find problematic, but I basically wanted to get at places that had periods of stability and then had some degree of armed conflict, even at a minimal level. And so I looked. I can go into details about the data set, but I don't want to waste a lot of time. But I looked at countries that had at least 1 year of peace, according to Furon and Layton's data set. And then I also looked, because that ended in 1999, I wanted to bring it up through 2007 when I started to do the research in 2008. And so I added, and he didn't come up past that time, so I added cases from the Uppsala PRIO data set, and I took it down to internal armed conflict for that interval between 1999 and 2007, which picked up cases like Haiti and East Timor, which most not considered to be real civil wars, but do constitute armed conflicts according to that data set. And then I went through and I threw out cases where you had messy, like 5 civil wars at any given time in a country like India, and because country was my unit of analysis, and I went through and I threw out other cases where there was not clear that even though you had a year of stability, no one really, basically I looked at perceptions of peace on the ground and a widely understood sense that yes, we're expecting that this peace will hold. So I threw out cases like Oslo. It's always nice to throw out Middle East conflict if you can, unless you're going to spend a whole lot of time on that conflict in this business. And so I can give you more details, but basically that's what I did. So what are the findings of that component of the research? The findings were 2 or 3 that I want to share with you. One is what I defined as what I found. Again, I did not go looking for this. I found that exclusionary behavior by post-transitional governments was the main precipitating factor in 11 of the 15 core cases that I just mentioned to you. And so that includes all the cases that I mentioned to you, and I can talk to you about Liberia, for example. I did a full-blown case study because it's normally considered to be a case where resources and economic arguments are very powerful. In fact, it's one of the main ones that school of thought had in mind when they developed those theories. And what I went and found is basically that the exclusionary behavior by Charles Taylor, certainly there's weak institutions, another counter-argument I consider, weak states. There's also economic factors and natural resources, another counter-argument that I considered, but that really this exclusionary behavior was pretty crucial in understanding why disaffected elites who had come to expect a role in the government took up arms subsequently. So let me just tell you just really, and I found that in 11 of those cases. How do I find exclusion? I'll just tell you this real fast. The perceived or actual deprivation of an expected opportunity for former warring parties or the social groups that they purport to represent to participate in state administration through either appointed or elective offices. Okay? I'll come back to that. But so that's one of the findings that I have in this book. And a second finding from these cases of these 15 cases, that I basically did 3 chapters of mini case studies on these 15 cases, except for the one full chapter on Liberia. And so, again, the serious quantoids will criticize my method for not being sufficiently controlled, and the qualitative people will criticize it for not actually getting at the full richness of the cases, but there you go. I did something that I wanted to look at because I wanted to actually see the full pool of cases, and I wanted to do it in one place, and I wanted other people to be able to see that, and that's why I developed this approach. Secondly, violations of power sharing occurred in 40% of these war recurrences. I'll come back to that in a minute, but notice the emphasis here on my analysis is on agency, like the agents who participate in a power sharing arrangement violating the deal that they have cut in terms of exclusionary and inclusionary behavior, okay? And third, that there were other factors present, but exclusion was really the most consistent and prevalent trigger. I've already mentioned weak states. I've already mentioned economic resources, which are the two main counterarguments that are out there. I can come back to it. I'm leaving a lot of the theory out for this talk, by the way, so we can come back to it if you want. I also have a chapter on the four cases that defy my argument, okay? I'm just going to tell you very quickly the three findings that I take from those four cases. Those four cases were Lebanon, Mali, Peru, and Nicaragua. And those findings are, one is that insurgent initiatives were key in two of those cases, Peru and Mali. In other words, it sort of contradicts my thesis that this has to do with like the government violating an expected arrangement for exclusion, because the insurgents actually did it. Secondly, failed power sharing played a role in two cases, Lebanon and Mali, where basically there was not agents that were violating it. It was violated by others, if you will. Outside factors play key roles in several of these cases. And finally, they really point to the need for a regional level of analysis in this whole business. And I'll come back to that as well. Then the next thing I did was something I hadn't anticipated doing in this project. I decided to look at the cases of non-recurrence in this pool of 69 civil wars. And the cases of non-recurrence between 1944 and 1999, extended out to 2007, where you had a civil war and there was never any other civil war in that country. And so, those, you'll see what those cases are in a minute. So there are 27 of those cases, okay? Many of these are the best known successful peace processes that come to mind. And remember, this is a negative peace bar, so I'm not looking at the justice of these regimes, etc. So one of the findings there's two or three findings I'll share with you from this. This was, for me, the most interesting finding because I didn't go looking for this, and I basically became a fan of power sharing as a result of doing this research. I wasn't a fan of power sharing before, but now I am. But before I do that, one of the things that I found is that the character of war termination changed with the end of the Cold War, and that suggested something very important to me as I looked at these cases and thought more theoretically. This is a very inductive approach, is that there's an important role for historic context and norms in analyzing civil war and peace. And so that means that basically how we think about war and peace is heavily conditioned by the historical moment we're living in. And one of the things this suggests is that it's a little problematic to do big quantitative studies across decades because what those wars signify and what they mean is a little bit different over time. And so the most significant marker of this is the fact that there's 26 cases here of civil war terminations that did not recur. Of the ones that ended before 1988, of those 10, 8 of them resulted in victory. Of the 16 that ended after 1988, only one of them ended in victory, and the others all ended in negotiated settlements. Okay? And so we all know this, but it really drives it home. There's other scholars who've pointed to this. But really, negotiated settlements became in favor, and victories are less common. And that changes the way we think about peace and war, and it's an important thing. So, and I'm going to bring these two. So now I'm going to come back to my other finding, which is that power sharing was highly correlated with non-recurrence. And so in this case, there's of these 27 cases where there were elites that entered into power sharing arrangements. Of the ones that were abrogated, there were 7 that were abrogated, and of those, 6 of them resulted in recurrence. And of those that were not abrogated, 15 out of 18 were cases of successful non-recurrence. Okay? Among those cases are Angola, Bosnia, Croatia, Djibouti, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mozambique, Nepal, thus far, South Africa, Tajikistan, Northern Ireland. So one last thing on this, one last finding I'll share with you really fast, and that is that subsequent to the Cold War, exclusionary regimes experienced recurrence, but inclusionary regimes have not. And so let me just point out that exclusionary behavior, you used to be able to get away with that during the Cold War. So you have non-recurrence in countries like Cuba, in countries like Jordan, in countries like Vietnam. These are successful non-recurrence cases of civil wars. They have not had recurrence of civil wars. But since 1988, if you are an exclusionary, and they are exclusionary regimes, but since 1988, if you are an exclusionary regime, you have experienced recurrence in every single case except for one. Okay? So I am going to, because of time, just mention a couple of theoretical implications of this. And one of those is that I'm looking here very much at local actors as the story here, national actors, I should say, rather than local actors, and not international actors. There's not the key actors here in terms of determining recurrence happen to be elites at the national level, not international actors necessarily. State legitimation is equally important as state capacity, which is a critique of the state-building literature in the way that I've presented in the book. I also basically say that I come down basically saying that we need to look at the communal level rather than individual level, so that the focus of liberal peace building on individuals and on democratization in particular is a little bit ill-placed, and that we need to pay more attention to community level analysis and what I call horizontal legitimacy, drawing on Holste, rather than vertical legitimacy, which is emblemized by electoral practices. And what I end up advocating is inclusive policies that I call legitimacy-focused peace building in the book, and I developed that concept a little bit. Finally, what are the policy implications here? 2 or 3 of those, okay? One is there's a need for focusing more on building inclusive political arrangements. Now, I had most of this book written before the World Development Report of 2011 was mentioned, in which highly emphasizes inclusive political arrangements. And this has been, now is all the fad amongst all the development agencies, I should tell you. And so when they were happy to have it, and they urged me to hurry up and finish it so they could cite it in the report. That didn't happen, but instead I cite the World Development Report in the book. So secondly, then there's the need for heeding the perils of orchestrating legitimacy from without. And that is, it's an inherently contradictory thing for external actors to try to build internal legitimacy of national governments and elites. Because we're a different source of legitimacy by interfering with the relationship between a state and its people. And so I go through different ways to overcome the elements. I go through different ways that that's a contradictory thing, and there are obstacles to doing that, and I basically go through different ways to try to overcome those obstacles, including talking about legitimacy rather than democracy promotion. It's one of the ways. Third, remaining vigilant against exclusion, especially after the first president is elected. And this was really one of the key things that was relevant for the peace-building apparatus at the UN and for actors in general, which is that after the first president gets elected, all the attention goes away, all the money goes away, people start to look elsewhere for the next crisis, and that, in fact, is one of the key moments in which exclusionary behavior starts to happen. And that happened in Haiti, it happened in Timor, it happened in Liberia, all cases where the UN had to resend new peacekeepers because they thought that they had a successful peacekeeping operation, and it turns out they didn't. And so they had to send in another one after conflict was renewed. And so that's one of the findings that I have. And I could go on, but I won't. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chuck.
Good afternoon. My task, and I made sure to consult with Lily so that we hopefully didn't all duplicate one another in our comments, but my task is to talk about a point that Chuck makes early in the book regarding his finding, and this is both in his statistical model of war recurrence and throughout his case studies, that economic factors, and particularly poverty or lack of development, do not figure significantly as explanations of Civil War recurrence, which is an interesting finding because there has been a lot of emphasis on by people like Paul Collier on the economic explanations for both war onset and war recurrence. So I'm going to start by making a few observations about that point, or what Chuck didn't find in his study, and then I'm going to link those to what Chuck did find in his study, and then end by making a few points about what all of this might mean for the study of this important topic of war recurrence. So focusing first on the quantitative study, Chuck finds that GDP per capita, which is commonly used as a measure of economic development, does have a statistically significant effect on Civil War onset, as lots of other scholars have found, but not on Civil War recurrence. The coefficient is signed negatively, which is in the right direction, meaning, okay, it should help decrease the likelihood of recurrence, but it wasn't significant. That finding is interesting in that, as Chuck mentioned, there really hadn't been any book-length treatment of this topic, but there had been a few articles out there beforehand, and a number of those articles or studies had found that focused on the risk of lapsing back into armed conflict, had found that countries with low levels of economic development are particularly vulnerable to a renewed outbreak of civil war. So there's a little bit of difference there in Chuck's finding with those. However, and this is a point that Chuck makes in his book, that result doesn't actually give us a whole lot of traction as to why that is the case. The most commonly given explanations for this relationship between the low levels of GDP per capita and renewed war are that with economic options even worse after a civil war. In other words, civil wars make bad economies probably even worse, and there are more problems in finding employment for young men and women who have been demobilized, etc. So the argument there is that after a civil war, with even fewer economic options open to them, individuals might be then willing to rejoin rebel forces because that's the only kind of employment they can find. That links up to this so-called greed thesis, although put that way, it might be better called a desperation thesis, right? You can't find a job, then what do? Your commander is still out there doing something, you join back up again. The other main explanation that's commonly given to try to explain this relationship between low GDP per capita and Civil War recurrence is to say that, and Chuck just talked about this a little bit, states, once they've been further weakened by Civil War, are probably unable to exercise effective control over their territory, including dealing with remaining pockets of rebel resistance. So in other words, low state capacity is probably made even worse by Civil War, and that might be the relationship there. So if those are the two main explanations, which is right? Which is the right explanation? And what I want to argue is that none of the models that find that relationship between GDP per capita and conflict recurrence can tell us definitively that either of those factors is what drives the result. Certainly Chuck's case studies don't pinpoint either of those explanations as salient reasons for the recurrence of Civil War. And he does look in both the mini case studies, the longer Liberia case study, he looks in each of them at, well, what role do economic factors play? And he doesn't find that they're particularly persuasive as reasons for the recurrence of Civil War. This goes to highlight a point that Chuck makes in his book, and he makes it really effectively, which is that a lot of the measures that we use as proxies for things we think are important explanations for Civil War or its recurrence are pretty general or crude indeed. As someone who does quantitative work, I don't believe that means we should abandon this approach entirely to identifying important factors or trying to use quantitative methods to make important generalizations. What I think we should do is to more clearly identify the concepts that are central to our explanations or that we think are really doing the heavy lifting, and then go out and collect data on those. And that's exactly what Chuck has done with the concepts of inclusion and exclusion in this book. So, I mean, I think that that's a really important contribution that he's made with this book. Chuck doesn't say so in his book, but with this focus on these two concepts, inclusion and exclusion, he hones in on one of the key arguments of what has become the preeminent theory of why this suboptimal behavior called war occurs or recurs, which is the so-called bargaining theory of war. One of the conclusions that the bargaining theory of war leads to is that we're much less likely to see wars recur when one side wins a military victory, because that provides the losing side with important information. That important information is, I beat you, you can't possibly beat me in the future, so don't try again. So that would be the information component of what a military victory is supposed to communicate. And then the other thing is that the argument is that after a military victory, the winners dismantle the organizational structures of the losing side, which means, among other things, that there's no credible commitment problem, which is another part of this theory. There's no credible commitment problem because, in other words, I don't have to worry that you're going to commit to whatever settlement we've reached because you can't come back anyway. I've destroyed your organization, right? So that's sort of the essence of what is today the main theory, this bargaining theory of war. The problem with this theory is that we actually don't know, based solely on the identification of whether a war ended in a military victory or a negotiated settlement, how the opposing sides in a conflict actually behave towards one another once the war is over. These are all assumptions, right? The assumption is that I win a military victory, you lose, I'll go ahead and destroy your organizational structure, all right? But really, it is possible that winners could behave with some restraint toward the losers and make use of inclusionary policies, case in point, Civil War, Biafran Civil War, right? For example. Or one could have negotiated settlements that involve only minimal levels of inclusion and or that include some actors but exclude others. So negotiated settlements aren't necessarily inclusionary. Actually looking at Civil War cases then and identifying whether inclusionary or exclusionary policies were adopted, as Chuck has done, can help give us a lot more traction then, I argue, on the question of why some wars recur and others don't, than the use of crude proxies such as war outcomes, which have been relied on so heavily in all these theories of Civil War. This is important because, as Chuck makes clear in what is probably my favorite part of his book, Civil wars now overwhelmingly end through the use of negotiated settlements, as he just talked about. Even when one party to a conflict has, for all intents and purposes today, won the war on the battlefield or in the jungle or such as it is, and a case in point is the Philippines. The 1996 settlement with the MNLF in Mindanao, according to all experts, essentially the MNLF was defeated. And yet, that civil war is frequently quoted as a negotiated settlement. Why? Because external actors pressured for a negotiated settlement to be used to actually end the war. So even when we're seeing what are de facto military victories, we're really seeing nowadays negotiated settlements being used to end these wars. This is a trend that began with the end of the Cold War and that hasn't shown any sign of abating. As Chuck makes clear, a number of factors appear to have played an important role in making negotiated settlements, with their emphasis on inclusionary policies of power sharing, the favored means of ending wars. He talked about some of these, but including the spread of norms favoring this mean of ending wars. Larger numbers of and more robust peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace enforcement efforts, and mediation efforts as well. And I was actually thinking about this, and I was trying to think of other things that might be pushing this trend today, and I thought maybe even things like the spread of information technology. Now, settlements that are negotiated in one part of the world aren't necessarily secret or unknown to actors who are engaged in conflict in other parts of the world. I'm not saying exactly they're twittering to one another what the terms of the settlements were, but there's more and more knowledge now of the kinds of terms that some actors have been given when ending a civil war, and that might lead to pressures for other actors to get those kinds of terms as well. Given the preeminence of this mean of ending civil wars, then, we need to know more about what aspects or elements negotiated settlements, what are the aspects or elements of negotiated settlements that best help to keep the peace, which don't, etc. And what I think is that Chuck has taken us a good distance in that direction with his focus on inclusionary and exclusionary behaviors. I want to make kind of one final point here and then end with a couple of quick suggestions. And the point is that I think that these concepts of inclusion and exclusion are important and can travel or provide us with insights into other important questions related to civil wars and post-conflict peace. I'll do that by circling back to the economic realm again and its relevance to civil war. One common finding in quantitative studies is that high levels of post-war economic growth, high levels of post-economic growth rates, actually make the recurrence of civil war a lot less likely. The project I worked on as a fellow at USIP sought to determine whether the terms of civil war settlements, the nature of the agreements reached when ending wars, or more specifically, who gets what when a war ends, had an impact on post-conflict economic growth rates. My focus differed from Chuck's a little, but I too was interested in whether settlements that were inclusionary in nature, which I defined as settlements that encompass the majority of the groups that fought in the conflict and that allowed them to retain their identity as well-defined adversaries in the bargaining process, that's the who part, had an impact on economic growth. I also focused on whether the settlements that were distributive in nature, meaning they allocated various forms of political, military, territorial, and economic power sharing among former armed factions, had an impact on economic growth. That's the gets what part, so who gets what. I found that exclusionary settlements had a negative effect on post-conflict economic growth rates, and settlements that had a distributive component to them had a positive effect on post-conflict economic growth rates. So I think Chuck and I should talk after this, right? So let me just end with a few suggestions about where we might go with all of this. One is to say that it seems important to carefully study the terms on which civil wars end, the way Chuck has in this book, rather than continuing to focus on concepts such as military victory and negotiated settlements. What we want to know are, what are the deals warring groups arrived at? Why did they arrive at these particular deals? And again, all of this serves to emphasize the role of agency with respect to ending wars, which is something that Chuck just mentioned a few minutes ago. Second, it strikes me that once we know more about the terms of these war-ending agreements, such as whether they were inclusionary, exclusionary, etc., we want to extend the study of their impact beyond the important question of the duration of peace or recurrence of war to other important outcomes such as post-conflict democracy. Does it matter? Does this have an impact on it? Post-conflict human rights, post-conflict development. And finally, having said that, we need to know more about why factors like inclusion, exclusion, the distribution of power, the centralization of power have the types of impact that they do. Turning back to the question of post-conflict economic growth rates as an example, although I'd like to believe that inclusionary and distributive civil war settlements have a positive effect on post-conflict economic growth because they bring formerly marginalized communities into the economy, I suspect that the mechanism might be that these measures prove reassuring to foreign investors, and thus it's often the case that foreign direct investment accounts for a big portion of the boost in economic growth rates, not a more equitable type of development, which is what I'd love to believe. And the same sort of point with Chuck's focus on legitimacy, how it would be interesting then to do things like interview people on the ground in these conflicts to see what their perceptions are about whether these inclusionary or exclusionary settlements contribute to legitimacy and thus to a longer peace or not. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Thanks very much for inviting me here today, and I'm really happy that we get to talk about this book. That asks an incredibly important question that, as Caroline said and Chuck started to say, also it really hasn't been asked yet in the literature is why do civil wars recur? We haven't been able to figure out why, and Chuck's book makes a really big step toward answering that question. This book is detailed, it's rich, it's nuanced, but at the same time he focuses on one big theme, which is inclusion and the legitimacy that comes with inclusion. And I think this important point really ought to be emphasized. I know in my own work and in many of my colleagues, we focus very heavily on trying to create the individual components of states. We're looking at the technical aspects of rebuilding states rather than this underlying, really important question of the very legitimacy of the state. We tend to overlook this question. So Chuck's book adds a really important new dimension to the debate. And for that, I'd like to thank him for this contribution. So that said, I'm going to start with 4 comments and questions, and then talk a little bit about my research, some of the research I've been doing here this year. So I have the inverse of Caroline's presentation. So 4 comments. The first is that I think it's really necessary to point out that peace most often succeeds. It's not, peace doesn't fail very often. It just, if we look around the world, the vast majority of the cases that are examined in this book aren't at war now. So peace has succeeded. In the 14 or so cases that are listed as present, they include, so I have a question. They include China, Russia, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Turkey, and I'm wondering, well, I have a hard time thinking of these cases of these states as being in current civil wars. And I'd like to know, I wonder if we have a problem of selection bias, especially in that World Development Report where, they're citing 90% of the current civil wars are recurrences, but what is the more general picture, which I think the broader picture, if we look beyond that selection of cases, will be that peace most often prevails. The second question. You say that you don't want to be presenting a monocausal argument, and I'm pretty sympathetic to that view. I think we all know that there's really not one cause either of civil war or of civil war recurrence. We know that these things happen because of a lot of complex causes. But you still have really one argument that you're advancing. So I'm wondering how you square that. So, okay. My third question has to do with the project that one of the projects that I'm working on here this year, and that's, does the type or the form of inclusion matter? And I would argue that it really, really matters. I've been looking at power sharing agreements, and power sharing is such a slippery term. People define it in so many different ways. And one of the problematic methods of inclusion has been through ethnic quotas, religious and ethnic quotas. And I found a lot of really significant problems with these states that function by inclusion through ethnic quota. And I'm thinking mostly of Lebanon and Bosnia. We've moved in that direction in Iraq and Northern Ireland. I actually have a list of a bunch of other places. But the problems of ethnic quota systems are the following. They tend to lock in zero-sum ethnic tensions. So even though we might have a negative peace, we probably won't get toward positive peace because of this zero-sum ethnic game. They're antithetical, as you mentioned, to liberal notions of individual political rights, civic national identity, freedom of religion, representation and inclusion. I mean, in most liberal democracies, the idea of representation is that you can be represented by somebody who doesn't look like you and somebody who doesn't share your religion. But in these systems, the idea of representation is only that the person who shares some very specific features with you can represent you. This makes the transition to liberal democracy difficult because the systems are so divided. These systems tend not to function very well because of the severe immobilism with the ethnic veto. So, for example, if we look at Belgium, Belgium didn't have a government for 540-something days over the last year or so. Iraq didn't have a government for over a year. Bosnia didn't have a government. I mean, just recently, we have a lot of governments. Because of the ethnic veto, it's very difficult to govern. It's very difficult to come to decisions, to create a larger sense of the legitimacy of the entire polity as opposed to the narrow group. They also, I think, are problematic when it comes to economic structures because they inhibit growth. But anyway, I don't want to talk too much about the problems, but I think there are really specific and important problems with non-flexible inclusionary policies. So there are ways of including without defining people in sort of primordial terms. And that's what I think we could all probably talk about together. Okay. My fourth point is, does peace after peacekeeping really fail? My first book was about UN multidimensional peacekeeping, and I'd spent 2 years working at the UN, and I thought that I would be writing a book about peacekeeping failure, because that's all I saw and that's all anyone talked about. But then when I started looking at these big, complex, multidimensional missions that the UN had been engaged in, I realized that there are really a lot of successful cases. There are actually more successful cases than of failures, but nobody heard about them because they weren't very interesting. They didn't make the headlines. And I realized that the UN had actually become pretty good at multidimensional peacekeeping, these big peacekeeping operations where they're doing humanitarian relief and electoral assistance and retraining police and reintegrating troops and overseeing and actually overseeing how the state becomes knit back together after a civil war and actually engaging in that knitting process sometimes themselves. So we had some very successful cases in Namibia, El Salvador, Mozambique, Cambodia, Eastern Slavonia, East Timor. I would still count East Timor as a success. Sierra Leone. Liberia is still going on today, but we want to remember that the war recurrence in Liberia is the exception, not the rule. I think that Liberia, Liberia is not at war today. We don't have recurrence of war today. So is Liberia the exception or the rule? I think it's the exception. Okay. So one of the projects I'm working on this year has to do with how peacekeeping and peace enforcement work together. Because these are the two main methods we have to end civil wars right now. This is the way when there is a civil war in the world, this is the way we end them. There are negotiated settlements, but generally the main tool after a negotiated settlement is peacekeeping, or in order to get to a negotiated settlement, we engage in peace enforcement. In the early 1990s, peacekeeping missions were authorized in different ways. Some were authorized under Chapter 6, which is under the Pacific Settlement of Disputes, and some were authorized under Chapter 7, which is about peace enforcement. So it depended on the Civil War, but we had a very mixed picture of UN peacekeeping mandates. But since 1999, for those of us who like to look at data on occasion, we have an almost completely homogeneous picture of peacekeeping mandates. Peacekeeping missions are all mandated under Chapter 7 peace enforcement provisions. In other words, peacekeeping has become peace enforcement. UN peacekeeping has become UN peace enforcement, which is a puzzle for me because the UN is really good at multidimensional peacekeeping and not so good at peace enforcement. Peace enforcement involves the use of force to coerce one side, either to sign on to the peace agreement or just to dissolve. And UN peacekeeping operations, I don't know if you've ever seen them, but if for any of you have been involved in them, they're not war-fighting machines. I mean, you might have people from 100 different countries who don't speak the same languages, who, they can monitor ceasefires and they can help retrain troops and they can help knit things back together, but they're not designed, they don't have interoperable equipment. They're not designed to engage in military action. They're not designed to engage in peace enforcement. And yet they're all mandated now as peace enforcement missions. So for me, this is a puzzle. Why, when the UN is so good at doing one thing, does it have a mandate to do this other very hard thing? When we live in a world where individual states and small coalitions of the willing or regional organizations like NATO are actually quite proficient at peace enforcement. So we have peacekeepers being sent to places like Darfur, South Sudan, DRC. We keep trying to get the UN to go into Somalia, and the UN is providing a lot of logistic support in Somalia, and to these places where there's no negotiated agreement, there's no peace to keep, and yet we're asking UN peacekeepers to enforce the peace in these places. And I think it is probably an impossible mandate. So I won't spend too much more time, but I'll just say the two main policy points of this project are that we should do one of two things. We either want to start matching mandates with means, or going back to this division of labor of having the UN focused on multidimensional peacekeeping and having other things like states or regional organizations doing the peace enforcement, so that we can allow the UN to do what it does best.
Thanks. I wanted to take a slightly different approach as I was reading through Chuck's book, and actually more accurately skimming through it and reading the conclusions. But there were a couple of points that really struck me with this. One was the question about legitimacy and where it comes from, and then taking it, if you were to take inclusion as being one of the factors for non-recurrence, what does that mean for the way that we approach this as an international community? And I would say that sort of the corollary of that is that if there have been a number of recurrences, it probably means that at least part of the fault lies with the way that the international community has approached the way that it supports countries coming out of conflict. Now, I will still say that the vast majority of responsibility belongs to the people who are actually doing the fighting. But the international community as a whole is taking on these responsibilities, has that duty to try and get their intervention correct. So if you take what you're talking about, the inclusion part here, as being one of the major problems there, and I would leave some of the outliers out of this conversation, the situations where you have a party that because of its nature simply has no interest in making any accommodation with any other party. Some of the religious-based and others are very ethnically based. Others, kind of hard to see how you have to work separately on how to squeeze down that space and marginalize those people. But if part of your problem or part of your challenge then is to build up that sense of a connection between the governed and the governing, and to make that as inclusive as possible, it seems to me that a little bit of that changes a little bit the role that the international community needs to play. And it needs to find a way to bolster that sense of legitimacy and to push that sense of inclusion without taking on that role for itself. And maybe that means that we have a somewhat smaller type but more targeted intervention. And I come at this from both looking at peacekeeping operations from the early 90s on, plus living and working in Mozambique and Lesotho, which Mozambique has been a relatively good success story after 35 years of two separate civil wars. and then Lesotho not having a civil war, but having gone through an awful lot of political violence. And I pull a couple of lessons out of that. One is that there really is what I would call two tracks of approach to this, two tiers of approach to this. One that might be termed high diplomacy, traditional diplomacy, where you have ambassadors, special representatives, high-level panels who are responsible for engaging with the elite and pushing them on how do you keep this your commitments that are made under these peace agreements. Things that you see, for example, with the former president of South Africa working in Sudan. At the same time, there's also a tremendous space for track two diplomacy, where both in terms of just simply being eyes and ears and watching what's going on outside the capital, but also engaging in activities that can rebuild confidence between different groups that have been at war, finding ways to help promote those nonviolent means of conflict. They're not exclusionary, but I think you need to do both. But you also have to keep constantly pushing the pressure on the sides to find ways to do this. The other piece of this is the longer term engagement, and how do you stage that? It probably in most civil wars, as the country's coming out, the international community needs to be very heavily engaged in ensuring the implementation of this peace agreement. But it seems to me that part of that strategy also needs to be how quickly can you, or not how quickly, but how can you start to force the sides to work together and get them into the habit of dealing with each other. When I arrived in Mozambique in 1999, the embassy was very much in the habit of being the middleman between the Klama and Chissano. Every time the Klama, the head of Renamo, had a complaint, he would come running to the embassy and say, you guys need to go talk to Frelimo and you need to get them to do this. Okay, this was 5 years after the end of the Civil War. We made a decision with the new leadership in the embassy that we were going to wean them off of that they had to go start talking to Frelimo themselves. I mean, we would arrange the meetings initially, but eventually we had to be out of that middleman business. Otherwise, they would never get to the point where they would talk to each other, and we would constantly be in that frustrating position of trying to represent one side to the other. So that's a judgment call as to how you do that, but that really needs to be first and foremost in our minds, is how do you foster those sorts of things? And maybe it starts small, maybe it takes a long time, but if you don't have that in your mind, you're never going to get people habituated to talking to each other. The second thing that I think the international community can do, and I think this gets a little bit to your point, Lise, is to help look at the unintended consequences of peace agreements or of arrangements. You can have very free and fair elections, for example, that come out with completely unfair results. Again, the case in Lesotho, where the governing party kept losing percentage of votes, but because they had a very strong countrywide presence, they would still win 78 out of 80 seats, 75 out of 80 seats, and then a few months later the country would erupt into violence. So part of that role of the international community is saying, okay, we've got a problem here, guys, we've got a structural problem. How do you adjust your systems to be able to accommodate these other groups? So if you're looking at constitutions that perhaps are based on ethnic divisions and quotas, how do you adjust those over time? Because, I mean, Lebanon is a perfect example where they were based on certain percentages and certain groups having those seats. When those percentages get all skewed, you just have an unfair situation. So it's part of that, just simply looking at how do you adjust? How do you don't simply take the end of the peace agreement as the end state. These institutions have to evolve, and part of the international community's role is to help doing that. Just a couple of other really quick points that I would agree with the points. I think I would still raise the question of economics as part of this. Particularly because in so many of these countries, if you control the government, there is no other opportunity, and political exclusion becomes economic exclusion. And if there are situations, look at Malaysia, for example, where the ethnic Chinese have very little economic or political power. They have a tremendous amount of economic power. I know that may not be sustainable over the long term, but it's worked for a long, long time. If you have situations where you're excluded from political power, which means that you're excluded from any sort of economic route to prosperity or even economic security, it raises the stakes even more. So it may not be GDP in and of itself may not be an issue, but certainly the use of politics as a way to control economics has got to be something that we should take a very close look at. But I have to say that in reading this, I had a lot of aha moments. It makes a lot of sense from what I've seen. So I commend you on the book, and now you have the fun of taking it and turning it into practice, not simply writing about it. And then I get to sit on the outside and critique. So.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That was a very rich panel. Let you get your thoughts together, and then we'll go to the audience. I am still struck with this idea of legitimacy and how you get legitimacy and who confers legitimacy. And it actually, it was, I kept asking the question for all four of you, because it seems that, we're pretty clear that it's the parties to the conflict that have to make the peace. So, what role do internationals play in this? And each of you had quite different answers in some ways. And I was struck, even with the idea of peace enforcement and peacekeeping, the idea of NATO having as much legitimacy in peace enforcement as the UN does in peacekeeping, is a question. Is this an invasion or is this a peace enforcement mission? So I would like to hear from all of you a few more thoughts on, how do you actually get the parties to have or feel that kind of legitimacy that allows them to move on? Shall we go in order?
Sure. The same order? Very good. So first of all, I'm very pleased and thank you guys for reading the book so carefully and giving your thoughts on it. And I'm really happy that some people raised some good questions, which I hope I would like to respond to some of the points, but I think we should take some more questions first. On legitimacy. So others will have different, so there's a first problem. So I'm going to end up talking about a number of weaknesses of the book now, okay? And so one of them is that I overly simplistically equate inclusion with legitimacy in the book, okay? And so I think inclusion is actually a core element of internal legitimacy, and I'm talking about state legitimacy, not legitimacy of the parties, of the peace deal, or anything on that. I'm talking about post-conflict state legitimacy, of which the main elites, I think, are the main pillars of that, but it goes broader than that. And so it's a horizontal thing, and so you're talking about elites first, and then secondarily vertical, but you can't just do horizontal legitimacy anymore, because we don't have peace processes that exclude the civil society and the mass population of any longer. It's sort of not acceptable practice anymore, thankfully, which makes it a lot more complicated, the process of legitimation over time. And so all of that sort of background to what we're talking about here. And I had a whole long section on legitimacy that I ended up cutting from the book because it just looked like too much like a grad student dissertation. But I talk about different types of legitimacy in the book, and I won't go through them here. But you do have embedded legitimacy or inherited legitimacy that comes from, decades or centuries of states that are there. But you also have this service delivery legitimacy, what I call performance legitimacy, after Mark Suchman, a sociologist at Brown, which is sort of common to people, but it's not the only form of legitimacy that's out there. And I think development actors tend to overemphasize that. If we just deliver the goods, then we'll be legitimate. And I think the diplomats and political scientists think, oh no, if we just recognize them, and there's an external versus internal dimension, we as externals, by recognizing them, will enhance their internal legitimacy. But of course, that's highly complex and complicated, as we learned in the first few years after the Iraq invasion. That's not true, necessarily at all. And so it's a really complicated thing. And I go through there and I say basically different ways that external actors can enhance legitimacy. But certainly sending signals is one of those, and acting in a way that basically ensures that the right people continue to be at the table, and that your actions, either as a development actor or as a diplomat or as a military force, are not unwittingly or wittingly strengthening just one faction within society, particularly a dominant ethnic or religious identity faction that happens to have won the elections. And because they won the elections, well, we have to deal with them, and we can forget about all those other folks. And so I think that's sort of one of the main messages of the book in terms of my thinking about legitimacy. But I'll stop there.
Somebody else want to?
So I'm a big fan of power sharing as well. But I've been taking seriously a lot of the critiques that people have raised about power sharing and wrestling with some of those. And so one of the things I guess I want to just raise as an issue, and in doing so address critics of power sharing, is the potential that although inclusion may generate a form of legitimacy, critics of power sharing worry that there are also trade-offs that inclusion might generate, and that might compromise the potential for other types of legitimacy. So one common critique that is raised is, all right, if you include all these groups at the political center, for example, in terms of political power sharing, that you might end up with deadlock and inability to pass policy, thereby compromising sort of the effectiveness element of legitimacy. So that's an argument. We don't actually know that empirically yet, but that is a reasonable argument to make. So it's not necessarily the case that all good things go together, or all forms of legitimacy go together. Some forms of achieving legitimacy in some ways might compromise other forms of legitimacy, and I think we have to be aware of that, and aware of that at the table in talking about this, that there might be some possible trade-offs in all of this.
Great. I've always understood legitimacy in the Weberian sense, in terms of capacity to deliver. I mean, I think that was Max Weber's part of his original idea of what made for a legitimate state, was the capacity to guard borders and collect taxes and provide for your people, and to deliver on the functions of the state, which would make the organization legitimate. And so extending that capacity, the capacity sense of legitimacy to NATO, I'm thinking about NATO in Bosnia and Kosovo, and not so much in Afghanistan.
Okay. Some case selection
Yes,
issues
I know.
here.
We're not all good at all things everywhere. And then, in terms of Lebanon, the problem with Lebanon wasn't, from the Lebanese Civil War from 75 to 90, but then even beyond, part of the problem with a very narrow idea of who gets to be included in the state is that it leaves out this huge secular population. Because anyone who's not a religious actor all of a sudden is not a legitimate state actor, which is the basic question we need to ask about power sharing arrangements. How, for Bosnia, for that matter, too. I mean, 40 or maybe more of the % of the population is mixed. I actually can't think of anyone I know who's not mixed. And yet, if you want to be a political actor, you decide which ethnic group you're going to belong to in order to vote. And if you happen to belong to a minority religion or a minority ethnic group, a Vlach, Ruthenian, if you're of Jewish descent, you can't even run for office. So anyway, it's a problem of legitimacy in the sense of who gets to be included. I also just wanted to say, for any PhD students in the room, that Chuck's research design is really one that you should look at, even if you're writing about something else, because he covers the large N base. He has this, what you might call large N qualitative, which is he looks at a whole bunch of qualitative case studies, but not using regression analysis. And then he has his qualitative case studies where he spent quite a bit of time really studying them. And it's a really good way to do research, I would say. Anyway.
I would simply, from my perspective, legitimacy is not conferred ultimately from the outside. That the outside, the international community can perhaps sort of tap onto somebody originally to say, okay, you're in charge, or you can be part of this. But at some point, that has to come from the people within that society accepting that legitimacy. And if they are constantly simply seeing it as something imposed from outside, it'll never hold. Peacekeeping versus peace enforcement. I mean, to me, this is an interesting thing. Peacekeeping, one of the assumptions behind peacekeeping is that you are a neutral party as much as you can be between two sides that have decided that they want an end to their peace, whether they have come to that conclusion on their own or whether they've been held apart. Peace enforcement, you're either supporting a side or you are a side. And that's a very different role for either the United Nations or for NATO or a coalition of the willing to play. And it has very, your points, Lisa, about where, what are the question of the mandate. It has to be very carefully thought out about what is the role that we expect to play, whether it's the United Nations, NATO, or whomever. And it's perhaps not so much the legitimacy of the end state, but the legitimacy of the role that is played. And there are societies, countries where distrust of the UN is very, very high. They feel let down by it, so they will only accept a coalition. And other places where simply UN is absolutely required for legitimacy of the action, not necessarily of the end result.
Great. Well, lots of hands up. I'm going to bundle. I'm going to take 3 questions at the same time, if you don't mind, and then we'll start in the far back, in the corner. Is there a mic? There's a mic over here. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah, sure. Hi, my name is Daniel Moray. I'm from Johns Hopkins University, the Center for Transatlantic Relations. And for the past 30 years, I was a war reporter on the field. So my question, because really I don't know the answer, everything that you describe is really very, very fascinating. But I asked myself for 35 years if it's possible the civil war that I have covered in some way were ending also because people, the population, were tired.
And I think we're just going to start with this side. So, yes.
I can't speak loud enough.
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, my name is Rajit Das, and I'm an intern for Americans for Pro-Democracy. And I guess my question is all of you can answer, but in particular, I studied in school as a master's student about war, just in and just post. It seems to me that the description that you guys were talking about similar kind of resembles just post. So in your opinion, all of you here presented here today, what would you formulate as your ideal just post goal, and considering all the factors involved?
I'm coming to you next round. So please.
Ben Riley from Science and ANU. Chuck, can you? What I was hearing from Lisa and Caroline was an implicit critique of this idea that it's just a negative piece. I mean, Bosnia, or what you were talking about, sounded a lot like Nepal. You have every form of inclusion known to man and woman and minorities and civil society, everything the international community can think of. There's no war, but the state doesn't function, can't select the government. So I'm just wondering what the implications of that are. I know you haven't looked at it in your research design, but in answering that, maybe you can just explain a little bit more about what you mean by inclusion, because it wasn't entirely clear to me still.
Who would like to start?
Why don't you start, Chuck? Let's put the focus where it should be.
Great. War wariness. War wariness is a concept that was very much in play in the 1980s. Where's the gentleman? There you are. In Central America, and people talked about when does war wariness really make a difference? And I think I lived in a community of people who had been involved and fled the war, and they were repopulating, and many of them had been combatants, and their kids were combatants, and they were terrified, and were like talking about how great the good old days of feudal serfdom was, basically, in El Salvador in 1988, because they were so traumatized and affected by the war. It is not clear to me from a social scientific perspective how that factors in to how we understand this. And I think it's there, and what it does is it creates a pressure. And I'm curious as to, if you think about the Arab Spring now, how much technology and texting and social media might let war weariness actually bubble up a little bit more than it used to in previous decades. But I have no answer to that question. And so, but I think it's relevant, and it may be more relevant, but it's a relevant bubbling factor out there, particularly when populations are not all highly mobilized and participating in the violence itself. So you have cases like Timor and Rwanda, where vast portions of the population are highly mobilized. And that's a different kettle of fish, where you have a small portion of the population that are actually engaged in the warfare and affected by it, where that war weariness makes more of a difference in the latter cases than in the former, I think. So I'm not going to answer the just post-war. It's really a fascinating new area that I think is out there, and I think there's all kinds of concerns about how the standards for our interaction with post-war societies, and I'm very sympathetic to just war theory moving toward the post-war era, but I don't have enough good answers to actually share them, frankly. So, what do I mean by inclusion? I mean the inverse of the exclusion that I talked about. And so, to be specific, my answer on what is inclusion is very broad. Another weakness of the book, okay? Which is, I'm so broad that I include both power sharing and electoral liberal democratic arrangements where you have decentralization, so that if the former warring factions have any share of power that meets their expectations, and the perception is also part of it, then the standard of inclusion is met. And it's only sort of explicit inclusion where you're shoving them out of power in ways that violate their expectations that exclusionary behavior has occurred in the way that I've used it in the book. And so...
And you have examples of negotiated settlements that are exclusionary? It's just surprising to me that you would have these cases where
Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I mean, the most obvious one is Charles Taylor, which was not a victory, was a negotiated settlement in 1996, and then he was elected in 1997, and you can call it, again, I think Caroline is exactly right. It was like, how much is a negotiated settlement really a victory disguised as a negotiated settlement, which is Laos, for example, but also, and how much is a victory actually, not much of a victory, but sort of a victory, which is you've basically negotiated with huge factions, so you brought them in from the cold, and there's only a tiny remnant out there. So Burundi is another example where you basically picked them off and negotiated settlement after settlement, and then where do you get? So it's a complicated concept. I mean, again, there's a whole critique of quantitative methods, and the problems of quantitative methods has applied to this, and one of them is our concepts don't map themselves into doing quantitative research very readily in this business, as it were. So, and let me just take this chance to just respond to a couple of the critiques that Lise mentioned. So, yes, there's a couple. One, monocausal. That's right. I have my cake. I eat it too. One of the reviewers said, "Oh no, you can't say you don't like monocausal arguments, and there's multiple answers, and still emphasize exclusion so much." I'm like, no, you have to. You can't get noticed in academia if you don't have some answer that's. I mean, really, it's just like, how much do you like to? How much do professors like to read papers where students say it's all of the theories? Really, I mean, really, that's just, why would you even want to read that paper? Secondly. What is the critique of? I just want to say there's a couple of weaknesses here of the book, and which Caroline and Lise both pointed to, is I have such a facile notion of inclusion. I've had people come up to me and say, "I can't wait to read the book, because you're going to tell us you're going to give us different kinds of inclusion, and which ones matter and which ones don't, and how do we foster inclusion, and which ones have worked." I'm like, oh God, no, I don't do any of that in the book. All I do is basically say, this ends up being important. And so there's a whole generation of research now that needs to be done that, by the way, DFID is really interested in funding. On how do we think about inclusion and different types of, Claire Lockhart was just telling me last week that she's got a new project to think about 4 different types of inclusionary political arrangements, and how do we do that? And that is exciting to me, and I'm not going to be doing it, so I encourage Caroline and others to do it. It's really great and exciting work, I think. What else? And so you mentioned I don't think so. In the book on power sharing, So the standard critiques of power sharing, I present them in the book. Most of them Lise mentioned. But I basically say that there's not, okay, big problems with power sharing. Bosnia, Northern Ireland. Yeah. Are they at war? Okay. That's my point. They're not. Okay? And so that's the first point is if you care about stability and you care about negative peace, then this stuff is I'm convinced, is a very good thing, power sharing. That said, it does have a lot of negative characteristics that lock in, that Lise mentioned, okay? So one of the things I do in the book is say, you need to build in sunset clauses for power sharing. Timelines. You need to build in mechanisms, as Ambassador Loftus mentioned. How do you build in mechanisms? And it's hard to do, but you build in timelines for review of and revisiting the power sharing arrangement. There's ways you can do power sharing that are based on not quotas for specific groups, but shares of power for whoever wins the election. So maybe if the Green Party ends up being the big party and winning elections, then it's not about ethnicity anymore. It's about the Greens versus the whomevers, right? And so there's mechanisms that we have to actually diminish the negative effects of power sharing. And those, I think, are exciting ones that we need to look at more carefully and think about more carefully. And so I say that. You won't get to positive peace. I think that, yes, you might very well get to positive peace. And I think, and I don't have, again, these are some of the ways that you can get to positive peace. But I do think just looking at negative peace doesn't mean that you've given up on positive peace. And I think participation by civil society actors in these stages is important in modifying arrangements that are horizontally legitimate but not fully vertically participatory. So yeah, you mentioned Belgium not having a government, right? Okay, how many people really noticed? Okay, so they did not go to war. They did not go to war. Nobody seriously was worried about violent conflict in Belgium, I don't think. But I think that, these arrangements that are power sharing arrangements have worked in places like the Netherlands and Switzerland for many decades. And so I think that to say that they don't lead to broader legitimacy is a little bit too quick and easy. And let me just say one thing about peace fails. I think so the title says why peace fails, and it makes it seem like I'm emphasizing the failures. Well, originally this project, when I came to USIP, the name of my project was Making Peace Stick, which is the name of this event, in fact. And Making Peace Stick was the name of my project. And basically, I was talking about titles for the book, and Making Peace Stick was going to be the title. And then I was talking about Why Peace Fails, and my wife was like, oh, Why Peace Fails? That's a much better title. I mean, really. And so I started asking people, I'm like, Why Peace Fails? Is that better than Making? Oh, no, Why Peace Fails is much better, much better. And so I was like, okay, so there you go. But in fact, it's about Making Peace Stick as it is about Making Peace Fail.
Plus, there's another book called Making Ideas Stick. So.
Indeed. So anyway, so can I just make a quick point on peacekeeping and peace enforcement, which is, I have a partial answer to that, but I think your broader question is a good one. And that is, I want to make a distinction. I mean, the reason that Chapter 7 is now the norm is not because there was a decision to get the UN involved, DPKO involved in peace enforcement. It's because peacekeeping operations increasingly came up against the problem of violence against them and rules of engagement under Chapter 6 that limited them. And so the Security Council and Jean-Marie Guéhenno, when he was head of DPKO, basically worked to convince the Security Council that we needed to have broader and more robust mandates in case we needed them. So basically Chapter 7 became the norm in case we needed them, but that did not change the logic of peacekeeping as practiced and thought of, I think, in general by the Security Council. What you are talking about, however, is what Ambassador Loftus mentioned, is which DPKO is committed to going and doing peace where there is a peace to keep. In other words, where there is an agreement. And yes, you're right that there is deployments now where there is no agreement to keep. DRC is not one of those. But, and that is a question that is complicated and can lead to one-sidedness, but doesn't necessarily lead to one-sidedness. And I think peace enforcement is one-sidedness, just as Ambassador Loftus said. And just because it's Chapter 7 doesn't mean it's peace enforcement, in my mind. And so I would make that distinction. And the UN, certainly the idea that just because it's the UN would just say, no, just because it's Chapter 7, we are not doing peace enforcement. We're doing peacekeeping, that might get sucked into peace enforcement, even though, of course, officially the UN does not use the term peace enforcement. So I'll stop there.
I'm going to go to questions on this side of the room, and if any of the other of you would like to answer some of the former questions when we come to answers, we will do that. Shel.
My name is Adnan Abodia. I am a former fellow here at the center. My question has to do with the economy. Did anyone, one of you, ladies and gentlemen, during your studies, address the issue of the type of economy in a certain country, in a given country, where a civil war could erupt? For example, would it be more possible for a civil war to flare up if you have a rentier economy or a productive economy? I really, rentier economy, for example, because in fact I was inspired by the idea which the ambassador mentioned about political exclusion leads to economic exclusion. Now, in my own country, I am a Jordanian. In my own country, what we are witnessing now, that the political exclusion is leading to the economic exclusion, which is very important. Now, because I live in the country and I have the feeling of the people and I know everything about it, I am really worried about the future. That's why I'm asking this question. The relationship between the type of economy in a certain country and the flaring up of... My second question has to do with Sri Lanka. What do you think of Sri Lanka? The peace we are witnessing now is a peace resulting from smashing victory of one side over the other side. Would it require... Now, the question is, how would you think of changing the situation to a situation of not recurring to civil war again? And my third, it's not a question, it's only a remark to Mr. Rowell. My remark is, you said, you in fact cited Jordan as an example, one of your examples, of the non-recurrence of civil war. In fact, what happened in Jordan was not a civil war. I was in that, let me call it, military encounter. I was the Minister of Information. And it was a real problem to me to make the reporters believe that it was not a civil war, because it was something else completely. But it was the reporters who gave it the name. And, well, it settled as a civil war. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to just go very quickly through this side, please.
I'm Nancy Hayden from Sandy National Envoys, and I hope you can hear. And you mentioned something I wanted to come back to it from this promenade. The difference in the settlement of civil wars since the end of the Cold War, and if you just want to comment on why that is different, and what, in particular, what do we have to learn about that today? What that difference national community's intention?
My name is Martin Rebecca. I'm from Gallaudet University. I don't know whether to try to stand.
Here, would you like...
Just briefly, have you, about the issue of legitimacy, have you thought about perhaps that the processes of accomplishing inclusion or legitimacy depend on the kind of dispute, that we are talking about? We mentioned Mozambique, but the process of building legitimacy after that conflict and inclusion is very different, for example, than building in Bosnia. Even though we had a terrible civil war with 1 million dead, Renamo being called the Khmer Rouge of Africa, and so on, okay? But it's still, I think the process, no matter how difficult it was, of building that legitimacy of the state was still easier. As for Bosnia, where it is more difficult, I don't think it is really about how the people look. I think it is about power. But somehow, I think both cases are about the power and fight for power. But somehow, I believe that it's more difficult to build legitimacy. So what will be the best processes? for these territorial disputes? And the second question is about Monica Toft's book. I can't remember the exact title, but it was published a few years ago by the University of Princeton Press, and it argues that peace settlements that are the result of military victory, particularly by rebels, are more enduring than negotiated peace agreements. So I was just wondering what you can tell about that. Thank you.
There's a question in the back here. Yes? No. Lawrence?
Hi, Lawrence Boucher with SAIC. Sorry to raise a data question at the very end, but I just have some concern that we may be actually over-reading how central Civil War recurrence is to the problem of Civil War. Barbara Walter's data, which feeds into the World Development Report, has a very expansive view of what recurrence is, so that, for example, basically any country that had a civil war in the entire data set, which starts in 1945, that has a new civil war, it counts as a recurrence, whether or not it's 30 years later or the same issues with the same parties. So just wondering if anybody's looked at the data to try and get your own sense of the scope of how common civil war recurrence is in the full set of civil wars. I think it has important implications about where we invest our policy attention about recurrence versus new.
We started a few minutes late, so we're going to borrow time from from the beginning here and let you all have a pick which topics you'd like to address, and please have a final word.
Okay, then I'll start with the last question. Lawrence's question about Barbara Walter, everything is recurrence. I think that's problematic to define something that, where you have different actors, for example, different issues as recurrence, because then we're missing a whole lot of information. For example, if a civil war ends, and using my focus, there are certain terms that are agreed to for ending that civil war, and then another war breaks out 5 years later, but it's completely different actors and it's completely different issues, but we term it recurrence, then we're going to say, well, apparently the way it was settled was problematic, right? You're going to ignore, whereas it may well have been very successful. You don't get another war between those sets of actors over those sets of issues. But if you deem everything recurrence, every succeeding conflict recurrence, you're going to miss important information about what worked and what didn't in ending keeping certain wars ended, or in some cases maybe legitimately it was a recurrence of a conflict with the same sets of actors, issues, etc. So I think it is important to distinguish. I have a data set of 126 civil wars, 1945 to 2006. I do take a lot of care to distinguish when wars recur, when it's the same sets of actors, issues, etc. And based on that, I find that a little over 50% of civil wars recur. Was there anything else? Monica Duffy-Toft, someone asked a question about that, right? You did? About her, Monica Duffy-Toft's book?
Yes.
Yeah, about the argument that rebels, I think, military victory by rebels. A lot of people have asked questions about her data set, for example, so I think that might be something people might want to look at. I also just want, my final word would be sort of something that Chuck brought up earlier. At least until recently, when the international community has begun to push for negotiated settlements so much and sort of, even when maybe there's actually a military victory, get the parties to the table. Sri Lanka is an interesting case in point. Very soon after the military victory in that war, you started seeing actors in the international community say, and now you need a negotiated settlement. And they were like, hey, we beat them. We're not, what's our incentive to negotiate with them? But there is a selection effect here. I mean, in the past, certainly, it was a certain type of civil war where parties agreed to a negotiated settlement, and they agreed to power-sharing measures. And I think that when we don't take that into account, so my discomfort is where we say things like power-sharing gets in the way of liberal democracy. It's it's not clear to me that the kinds of countries where these actors have agreed to power sharing were ever reasonable cases where we should expect liberal democracy to emerge anytime in the near future. And I think we have to, take that into account too, that only certain kinds of countries at one point were agreeing to these power sharing measures, and they were agreeing to them because they had very difficult, ugly, messy, horrible conflicts. And the very difficulty of those conflicts it sort of gets in the way of expectations of any time soon after a war ending, you're going to have great human rights records, great liberal democracies emerging, etc. So I think it's important to keep that in.
Thanks. Just picking up from what Caroline was saying, I think, though, that it's also really important to recognize that very rigid power sharing arrangements, when they're based on ethnic quotas, have been a direct cause of civil war. Lebanon is one case, and Iraq is another case, where when inclusion in the government in Iraq meant that you had to sign on to one of the ethno-sectarian groups, even though a lot of people saw themselves as Iraqis, not necessarily belonging to one of those groups, but that the only way to participate in the government was through that it was our voluntary policy also, choosing the original political arrangement for Iraq. It's not as if anybody forced, the formula of 13 Shia, 5 Kurds, 5 Sunni, 1 Turkoman, 1 Christian. I mean, that was our own invention, American, I would say. And similarly, the Constitution of Bosnia was written here in Washington. It's not as if it was an indigenous document that derived directly from Bosnia. I mean, so it's when there's a choice between different types of system, and when there are those rare moments when we actually have a say in how to construct the government. It doesn't happen very often, but that especially when people are interested in eventually moving toward liberal democracy, that if the founding institutions are based on inclusion through exclusion, I would say maybe, right? On exclusionary notions of identity, or primordial notions of identity, that even if you want, I mean, because in a lot of these places there are electoral politics, but you don't get much past them. Okay. I won't say anything more. That'll be my final point. But I'd love to talk to you more about Barb Walters' data.
Great. I just want to say before I go on, thank you to the U.S. Institute of Peace for the senior fellowship when I was here 3 years ago for writing this book, which I did not thank the Institute for that.
You're also a guest scholar.
I was a guest scholar some 12 years ago, and that was great too, by the way. Quickly, Lauren, question. So first of all, I do make a distinction. How do I count it really quickly is I count recurrent. So I have these 3 columns on this page 14 here in the book, where I distinguish between non-recurrent civil wars and new civil wars in the same country or territory, and what I call recurrences, which involve at least one of the same non-state actors, either in the government or out of government. And so I do look at a similar, or some of the same similar kinds of actors and issues, but the issues are, so there's a nexus there, but mainly it's the same actor is the category that I use. And how common is it? I have 15 what I call core cases, because I wanted clean cases. I wanted cases of people who say, okay, definitely peace, definitely war, definitely a period of peace, and definitely renewed armed conflict according to the data set, and I let somebody else decide that instead of me making that determination, basically, so I use the data sets. And so, how common is it? Well, it's more common because I didn't count wars. I counted countries with these clean wars. And so I have a selection bias in favor of smaller countries and not bigger countries, because bigger countries have more wars going on within them, and I threw them out. So I don't have a good answer for you of how common it is, but I think it is. It's not as common as the 90% the sky is falling and Chicken Little approach, but it is a serious problem nevertheless, I think. And part of the reason for that has to do with one of the points that was raised, and one of the points that Ambassador Loftus raised that I didn't comment about, which is another weakness and critique of the book that my students like and like to make, which is that, well, it's not so easy to separate out the political exclusion from these other counter arguments that I've separated them out from, including economic and the role of economic factors and natural resources. I do think that the political exclusion, as you mentioned in the example you gave, is sort of the key to the economic exclusion, and that was certainly the case in Liberia in the analysis that I have. But it's, there is, if you have weak state institutions, it's a lot easier to engage in exclusionary behavior. And so it's not so easy. There is an affinity there that you find in cases like Haiti and CAR and others, Timor, et cetera. So, so that's a point I would make about that. I'm not going to respond to the other questions that I don't have good answers on. Jordan, 1970, anybody can quibble with so many of these cases. I took somebody else's data set, as I said. Sri Lanka is really interesting because it is the closest case to defying the claim that I'm making about exclusionary post-war behavior doesn't work anymore. Because they are basically like, we're not listening to that. We're not listening to that. We're burrowing straight ahead with exclusionary behavior in some very important ways. At least they did in the first couple of years after the 2009 victory. And so I think it's an interesting process that has had some, horrible human rights violations, and we will see what happens subsequently. By the way, nothing I say here represents the views of the State Department. So, although that does. Although that does. A couple of final points here is that on settlements, why are they different? Well, there's a whole reason why we have settlements now and we didn't before, like the end of the Cold War was there, and the Cold War has ended, and big powers are no longer playing in the third world, and the neoliberal economic models, et cetera. But one of the factors of this is these frozen conflicts that are out there that I count has successful stability, places which are frozen conflicts like the Transnistria in Moldova, Abkhazia in Georgia, et cetera. And these are complicated for me because it's really the biggest critique of my theories. Like, really, you're counting that as a success? It's just a papered over frozen conflict and you haven't dealt with anything. And I think that is one of the liabilities of the whole new emphasis on negotiated settlements that result in sort of false negotiated settlements. But at least they're not fighting and killing each other. And if you have loved ones who've died in war, like I do, then it means something. But and the last questions you raised about legitimacy, I don't have good, I could talk about them, but I don't have good answers for them. But I think these questions about Mozambique versus Bosnia, I could agree with everything you said about that, and it would require a longer conversation to tease out why that is. And I don't have a good answer. And I certainly do think that revolutionary victories gain, because revolutionary insurgents have ideology, and that ideology is powerful. And if you fight in a revolutionary war, then your state has that as an enduring legacy. I'll just end by saying I am a Texan. And so we have an enduring ideological legacy to our revolutionary victory of 1836. Okay?
And having lived
thank
in
you very
Texas,
much.
I can attest to that. Bob, last word for you.
Oh boy, it's always fun to pull up the end. I guess what I come away from this is that, some rather obvious observation that putting together and holding a peace agreement is really hard. And the hardest part about it, to my mind, is actually figuring out that balance between trying to help people come to the conclusion and letting them come to their conclusion themselves. My wife and I just went to see 1776, which actually is the point of this. But as you're watching, this whole evolution, both of the Declaration of Independence for the United States, and then subsequently the American Constitution, which followed the Articles of Confederation, I can only imagine the result for the United States had there been Russian and French and Prussian and Chinese observers here telling us what we should be doing. I can only imagine, and this is not a slam on any of those countries, I can just imagine the disaster that it would be, because it would not be organic to the United States. I mean, our Constitution actually technically is unconstitutional because the Constitutional Convention was called merely to modify the Articles of Confederation, not to write a new Constitution. And had there been a United Nations, we would have all been up in arms. They would have all been up in arms about it. That, in my mind, is a plea to, it's not a plea for disengagement, but it's a plea to have a longer-term view that the arrangements that are put in place immediately post-war are not necessarily the most enduring. And that particularly if they are heavily shaped by the outside, you need to give that space for them to evolve so that you get away from the frozen conflicts. You get away from the idea that you enshrine these difficulties, these imbalances, or that will become imbalances. And it's a particularly difficult thing to do because, one, we like to say, yes, we've concluded this civil war and we will take credit for it. then we like to bounce off to what the next crisis of the day is, and we have then helped sow the seeds for future disaster. On the case of Mozambique, is actually a really interesting one, and in some ways it hits one of the points that Chuck makes in his book. And that is that the level of inclusion is very much driven by perspectives. If you look at the reality, Renamo has had almost no power since 1976 or 1993. They have representation, but they don't really have a lot of influence in how that government is run. But there is enough buy-in there's enough, I'll be cynical about it, the leadership has been bought off by nice houses in Maputo. They have salaries. They don't have the incentive as much to go back to war, even though the national anthem still says we're going to wade through the blood of Renamo. The national flag still has an AK-47 on it. All of these are all Frelimo symbols. Still, the war ended in 1993, and now we're almost 20 years later. These are still there, but there is enough. There's enough sense of legitimacy. There's enough sense that people are being paid. There's enough sense that they're not being shoved aside. That the peace has prevailed for the most part. Now, is that permanent? I would hope not. I mean, I would hope that there would still be enough of an evolution, but the important part is actually they are talking to each other. Slowly, fits and starts, things are moving backwards. But these take a long time, and it takes us to be engaged in that right way to help support them do that, and to point out where they may be going off track. Sri Lanka is actually a really interesting case study because it is, in many ways, a military victory. But if they pursue this path of exclusion, they will sow the seeds of renewed war. Because it takes two sides. You may say, I've won the victory. The other side does not necessarily have to agree to that as a permanent condition. And if they feel excluded, oppressed, that's why they started this war in the first place, they will go back to it. So our role is, we're not going to have a tremendous amount of influence over the government in Colombo. We're not going to dictate to them what their form of government is going to look like. But we had better be looking at every lever of influence and persuasion that we can find to say, guys, if you pursue this path, this is where you're going to end up. Thanks.
Thank you very much to all of you, and thank you to the audience for giving us 15 more minutes. And it has been recorded. Yes.
Give my best to Dick.
Yes, I will. You